malnutrition is the cause of 45% of deaths of children under 5 years old. And that is 3.1 million children that die from that every year. Yet, global wealth in 2013 reached a new all-time high of 241 trillion US dollars, an increase of 68% over the last 10 years. The challenge is that we are having more poor people despite very high economic growth rates. Today, 7 out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are not in Europe, not in Latin America, nowhere in Asia, but they are in Africa. Much is said about a rising Africa on the global economic stage. To be sure, there is a new energy and dynamism across the continent. It can be seen in the emerging middle class, improved governance, and a heightened interest by foreign investors. But amidst all this excitement, there remains a disturbing paradox. Africa is the continent with enormous potential for agricultural growth, yet one where food insecurity and malnutrition are widespread and persistent. There is therefore a disconnect between the nature of growth, the drivers of growth sectors, and the swelling number of poor people. The growth in Africa is being driven largely by the oil sector, mineral extraction, telecoms, and financial services. But we must recognize that over 70% of the world's poor people are in rural areas, and they depend on agriculture for their livelihoods. Therefore, to substantially reduce poverty, we must start by transforming the rural economies, and the way to do that is to transform agriculture. Agriculture sector growth is clearly the one that leads to pro-poor growth, because a 1% increase in agriculture's contribution to GDP leads to more than 3 to 4 times reduction in poverty than growth in the non-agriculture sector. The key is to generate wealth from agriculture, to expand opportunities for millions. In other words, we must make our rural economy the new wealth economy. What we need are economic ladders out of poverty. African governments must change their urban-centric development policy approach. While we clearly must develop urban areas to deal with the challenges of urbanization, we must recognize that rural economic growth policies have the greatest scope for lifting millions out of poverty. While beautiful skyscrapers light our cities, shacks and grass-topped huts have become the defining characteristic of our rural areas. Our rural areas simply became calcified in time as agriculture, which is the main source of their incomes, became neglected. As focus was on urban areas, scarce foreign exchange was used, or should I say, wasted, on importing food for the urban areas to keep price of food down. Africa became a net importer of food. As well as all other African countries, so did Nigeria also become a net food importer. And that, for me, is totally unacceptable. This is what we must change, because poverty cannot be the comparative advantage of Africa. A major reason for the poor performance of agriculture in Africa is that we have treated agriculture as a development sector, as a way to manage, not eliminate, poverty. To turn things around, we must end treating agriculture as a development program, and we must start seeing agriculture as a business. Africa actually is not the problem. Africa is where the solution really lies. But for us to unlock that potential, the lenses with which we look at agriculture absolutely have to change. We have to change from looking at it as a development activity to looking at it, as I said, as a business. Africa, therefore, in my view, with that kind of perspective, will become the solution for feeding the world. Nigeria was largely self-sufficient in food in the 1960s. We were also a major global producer and exporter of cocoa, crude palm oil, cotton, and shell groundnuts. I grew up, with currency in Nigeria where you saw a lot of very high granite pyramids all across the northern part of the country. Then we discovered the black gold, we discovered oil. We soon became too dependent on this resource as the economic driver of growth, export incomes, and development. One tragic result of Nigeria's dependence on oil was the abandonment of our nation's farmers and processors. Yields stagnated. The procurement of seeds and fertilizers became tainted by government corruption. Investments in infrastructure were redirected. Rural communities slid into poverty and unemployment. We soon became a food importing country, spending a whopping $11 billion a year on things like wheat, rice, sugar, and fish imports alone. Now, to get out of this, we must change our consumption habits in favor of what we produce. For an economy that is import dependent is a poverty manufacturing economy. Our fundamental resources include the abundance of land, water, and human capital. First, Nigeria has an estimated 84 million hectares of arable land. Yet today we only cultivate 40% of this land and only 10% of it optimally in terms of use of improved seed, fertilizers, better irrigation, and also mechanization. Now, but second is that we are home to two of Africa's largest rivers, River Niger and River Benue. Much of the country receives adequate rainfall to support farming. In fact, in Nigeria, our problem is not water, lack of water. Our problem is maybe too much water. But we are not doing well in actually efficiently utilizing that water to raise agricultural productivity. And third, we have a large and young workforce to support agricultural intensification, a workforce for which we need to create jobs and opportunities. And our 167 million consumers offer a large domestic market to support increased food production and processing. So therefore, to unlock the combined potential of these three fundamentals, we needed a major transformation of Nigeria's agricultural sector. That change had to come across the entire value chain, from the field to the mill to the table. To substantially reduce poverty, we must start by transforming the rural economies. And the way to do that is to transform agriculture. Agriculture sector growth is clearly the one that leads to pro-poor growth, because a 1% increase in agriculture's contribution to GDP leads to more than 3 to 4 times reduction in poverty than growth in the non-agriculture sector. The key is to generate wealth from agriculture, to expand opportunities for millions. In other words, we must make our rural economy the new wealth economy.